Does this control work? Does that right now? Oh, yes, it does. If amateur astronomers ever elect a patron saint, I'd like to nominate Russell W. Porter. Porter was the most public face of amateur astronomy in the 1920s and 1930s. And under his influence, amateur astronomy went from being a rich man's hobby to something all of us could enjoy. Porter was born in 1871 in Springfield, Vermont. Springfield is at the center of Precision Valley, the region of the United States where the American precision machine tool industry began. And as a young man, he was kind of restless. He moved around. He went to several colleges. Then he entered MIT, where for a brief period of time he studied art and architecture, developing his talents as an artist, which he had shown from a young age. And then at the age of 21, he attended a lecture by a polar explorer and became fascinated with Arctic exploration. And so for the next 12 years, he spent his time in the Arctic in a number of polar explorations. He went to the Canadian Arctic, to Greenland, and spent some time in the Russian Arctic. He got marooned over winter for a couple of years, stranded when his expedition's boat sank in the ice, and spent his time in a camp. In the Arctic, he worked as expedition artist and as surveyor, and this is when he first became interested in the sky. He would use the telescope on his surveyor's transit to look at the stars and look at planets. And over his 12 years, his dozen years in the Arctic, developed a keen interest in astronomy. When he came back to the States and decided to settle down at the age of about 38, he moved to Port Clyde in Maine, where he intended to set up an artist colony. And he started this venture. He started building cottages. The art colony never really took off. It became a development of summer houses. But at his time at Port Clyde, he began to become a telescope maker. He got his hands on a book on telescope making, the only one then available, read articles in Popular Astronomy by other American telescope makers, and trained himself in grinding and polishing mirrors. And he built a number of instruments. He built a polar telescope that had a relay mirror so that he could look at the sky from the warmth of his den. It was at Port Clyde that he began to build his skills as a telescope maker and became increasingly interested in the telescope building aspect of astronomy, which is what he was for the rest of his life. He wasn't known as a great observer. He never discovered anything in the sky. What he did do was teach people how to build telescopes. And based on his experience training himself in making telescopes, he began to teach other people. In 1919, he went back to Springfield, Vermont, invited by his old friend James Hartness, who was the president of the Jones and Lamson Machine Tool Company. Hartness was also an amateur astronomer. He hired Porter to design optical measurement apparatus for the factory. And in the course of working with Porter, he encouraged him to start a telescope making class. So in 1920, Porter put together a course in telescope building, teaching a number of machinists from Jones and Lamson, and as well as a woman school teacher that everybody fawned over apparently, because she was the only woman involved in the group, which they thought was novel. Taught them the techniques he had learned in telescope making, and they became the core of the Springfield Telescope Makers, the earliest telescope making organization in the United States, and they're still going today. They're still very influential in the amateur telescope making movement. At Springfield, Porter and the Springfield Telescope Makers set up their own observatory on Breezy Hill, overlooking the town. They call this Stellafane Shrine to the Stars. They built an observatory, they built a clubhouse, they painted it pink because they got the paint, of course they got the paint donated. And when you get donated paint, it's always pink. And it's still painted pink today. Porter started writing articles on telescope making. He wrote a very important article in 1921 called The Poor Man's Telescope that set up the amateur telescope making movement in the United States. Through very simple folksy prose, through beautifully clear illustrations. Remember, Porter was an artist. Porter began to teach people how to make their own reflector telescopes. And this article made the point that today anybody of moderate means and moderate skill could build an astronomical instrument more sophisticated than what was available commercially. And a number of people using Porter's very simple, very clear instructions began to build their own telescopes. Albert Ingalls, who was one of the editors at Scientific American, read Porter's article, got in touch with him, and started soliciting contributions for his backyard astronomy column in Scientific American. And through that column, Porter began to develop a national and an international reputation as a telescope maker, which is interesting because Porter really didn't innovate a lot in telescope making. What he was a wonderful popularizer. He had very clear explanations. He pointed out that anybody could do this, and then he showed them how to do it. And using his clear illustrations, people who might hesitate to read a textbook on optics could intuit the messages about how a telescope works and how you build one, how you grind and polish an objective mirror, how you figure it, and so forth. These are tasks that are very technically difficult. Many people have been doing them for a long time. Porter showed the everyman how you could do this. The backyard astronomer column became the amateur scientist column that I think a lot of us used to read in Sky and Telescope, along with the contributions of a number of other amateur astronomers. Ingalls put together an edited volume, which became the Red Bible for amateur telescope making. It was first published as a very thin volume, just about 50 pages in 1926. Over the years, it grew to 3 volumes and is updated. It's actually still in print, and it's still one of the main reference works that we use in telescope making. Though he's not usually known for his innovations, he did make some interesting inventions. He invented several kinds of telescope mountings. He invented the Springfield mount, shown here in the upper left, which had a fixed eyepiece position. So an observer could sit in a chair looking down into the eyepiece as though it was a microscope, and swivel the telescope around him to point at any point in the sky. The Springfield mounting was ingenious, but never really caught on. It was difficult to build. You had to be a machinist. Since he was working at Jones and Lamson, he was surrounded by machinists who could build amazing things. And while people gawked at Porter's illustrations in Scientific American with this telescope, not that many people actually built them. Porter also innovated the split ring mounting, a mounting that later was very important in some large telescopes like the Hale 200-inch telescope at Mount Palomar. He, along with Harkness, marketed a small garden telescope using this split ring equatorial mount. The telescope was extremely expensive at the time. It was made of cast bronze. He used his artistic talents to design it in the Art Nouveau style. It was beautiful, but only about 50 of the instruments were sold. It was never very popular. Today, it's widely sought after by museums and collectors, and they're being sold at prices of something like $10,000 a piece. They're extraordinarily expensive. Porter also continued his interest in comfortable observing at Stellafane in overlooking Springfield. He built a turret telescope that allowed him to sit in the comfort of a small building with the optics out in the air, where they would be acclimated to the cooler evening temperatures, and therefore they wouldn't have tube currents and so forth. But he could sit in the warmth, and this is in Vermont, which in the wintertime gets awfully cold. He could sit in the warmth and look at the sky through this telescope. In 1926, Porter and the Springfield telescope makers sponsored the first Stellafane convention. This was a convention specifically for telescope makers. they invited members of other astronomy clubs from around the country to come to Stellafane to talk about telescopes. They set it up like a chautauqua with public talks. There were demonstrations. There was a show and tell session where people shared their telescopes. Initially, about 30 people attended. Over the coming years, Stellafane is still going every summer. They now have an attendance in the thousands. And it's, though through Ingles' articles about Stellafane in Scientific American, star parties started popping up around the country. Stellafane is still the premier telescope makers conference. Porter's imprint is still on the way, is still there in the way Stellafane is conducted today. In 1927, George Ellery Hale, the famous solar astronomer, invited Porter to come to Caltech to work on the design for his great 200-inch telescope. Ultimately, that telescope was built at Mount Palomar. In the following year, Porter relocated to Pasadena, California. He spent the rest of his professional life working at Caltech. By this time, he had a national reputation as an amateur astronomer and telescope builder. At Caltech, he designed a number of pieces of astronomical apparatus for the Mount Wilson Observatory, for research projects at Caltech. He also drew up the preliminary plans using his training as an architect for the Griffith Observatory overlooking Los Angeles. Though Porter was on the team that designed the 200-inch, and amateur astronomers often credit him with the design of the 200 inches mounting because it's similar to some mountings that Porter had designed in the early 1920s. In fact, his primary contributions to the 200-inch were not for its mounting, was not the telescope itself, but the renderings he produced for the project. Porter trained himself as a cutaway 3D perspective artist. He was able to take sketches from the engineers, able to take relatively crude blueprints of components and draw them as very complex, realistic perspective renderings. This made it possible for the project to evaluate, essentially make a paper prototype of the telescope long before they went to steel and glass. Long before anything was built, they knew exactly how the components would not only look and operate, but how they would work with other parts of the telescope. Porter had an amazing ability to visualize the telescope as this giant inhabited machine. He saw it very differently from the way the engineers in the project, who were actually designing the components, viewed it. Porter realized that the technicians and astronomers were going to have to be swarming around this machine in order to actually do science. And so in his renderings, he thought about, okay, where are people going to stand? Where are they going to be? How are they going to get access to this part of the machine? Though he didn't actively, he was probably excluded from actively working on the engineering of the telescope itself. He was much older than the hotshot engineers that Hale had hired to work on it. And by this time, he was losing his hearing and was becoming rather crotchety by all accounts. Nevertheless, he did an extraordinary service to the production of this instrument by showing exactly how various alternative proposals would work. And through his renderings, they were able to reject designs that weren't going to be successful and pick a one that was extraordinarily successful and became the most important scientific instrument for a long period of time. So it was largely as an illustrator that he made his greatest professional impact. One of the interesting things about it, if you've ever taken perspective drawing, you know that the technical drawing like this requires rather complicated projection lines and measurements. Porter did a lot of this work essentially freehand. These renderings are so complex, and he showed the telescope and its components often at rather odd angles. That he developed a skill for just sketching these out. He would use a straight edge, but he could draw these quite rapidly. And when he went to shade them, people who saw him actually doing this work were astonished that he would just start in the upper left-hand corner and then shade the entire drawing down to the lower right-hand corner in one pass and be done. He was essentially doing what a computer graphics expert would do today, working on a big engineering project, but he would do it on paper and he would do it really quickly. The engineers would propose a particular change. A couple days later, he would have a drawing showing exactly how that change would impact the rest of the telescope. So though the amateur astronomers often credit him with designing the great 200-inch telescope, the reality is he didn't work as a telescope designer. He was mostly a visualizer. And much of the success of the 200-inch was due to his graphical abilities rather than his eyeball engineering telescope building. George Ellery Hale didn't live to see the completion of the 200-inch scope, which was one of the greatest contributions of his career. But Russell Porter did. Russell Porter, though feeling quite isolated from the project, was still recognized as one of the inspirations for the telescope. He was at first light of the 200-inch in 1947, and I believe he was the third person to actually look through the eyepiece at an astronomical object. First light for a telescope is its inaugural moment, the first time it actually looks at the sky. And this was an extraordinary honor for him. Porter died a year later. He died in 1948. But in many ways, his legacy lives on. The Stellafane Astronomical Conference still takes place every year, and because of Porter, it's still part of, it still has a strong emphasis on telescope making. One of the big events at Stellafane, Stellafane happens at the new moon late in July or early in August, every summer. The big event is their telescope building competition, where 30 or 40 telescope makers will take their scopes up to Breezy Hill by his pink clubhouse, which is still being run by the Springfield telescope makers today. They'll show their telescopes, a group of judges will come around, and they'll judge the telescope on its optical merits, on its mechanical merits. They'll look at evidence of craftsmanship and so forth. But because of Porter, the first thing they always ask you is, did you make the optics? That was Porter's point. Every astronomer should be able to make their own telescope. And that meant that you grind the mirrors, that you make the lenses of the scope. At Stellafane, at the competition, it doesn't matter how beautiful your telescope is. If you didn't make the optics, you're not going to get first place. At Springfield, there are really two shrines to Porter. Stellafane itself, the Hilltop Observatory, is still run as for educational purposes and as host of the Stellafane Conference every year. At Stellafane, you can see things that Porter built. Porter built the clubhouse itself. You can see his instruments. You can see his turret telescope. There's another museum in Springfield as well. At the Hartness Mansion, his friend and one-time boss, James Hartness, went on to become governor of Vermont. At the Hartness Mansion, in the underground den attached to Hartness's observatory, is a museum dedicated to Porter's work. There you can see Porter's paintings from the Arctic. You can see his drawings of the Palomar 200-inch telescope. You can see the sketches he did for the many articles on telescope building that he wrote. You can also see his prototypes and some of his original optics. If you ever have a chance to go to Vermont, go to the Hartness House and see the Porter Museum. That, in many ways, is where the amateur telescope making movement in the United States began. His works are still read. They're still part of the book Amateur Telescope Making, which contains a number of articles by Porter, is still on every telescope maker's bookshelf. It's still in print. The most recent edition has some additions to it, and they made some modifications, but all the original articles are still in it. This remains the Bible of amateur telescope making. He's known even outside of amateur astronomy. I noticed online the other day that there are a number of engineering websites that credit Porter as the originator of 3D or perspective cutaway drawings. And I never realized that. He is still seen, that ignoring his work on the telescope, he is seen as the greatest exponent of this form of graphical communication that now we're used to today. Porter still has a lot of influence. I want to leave with what he considered to be his life work. A nice quote about where he felt his work on telescope building begins. So I'll make my nomination. We had elections. We're having elections for the club. I'll make my nomination for patron saint of amateurs run. And I nominate Russell Buckingham.
Very informative. Thank you very much, Ross. Next up, we have Richard Townley that is going to present our future astronomy.